Welcome back to the Knowledge Cast. This is a look into the world of knowledge management, information management, data management, and everything in between, brought to you by Enterprise Knowledge. Today's session is part of a series where we have the opportunity to speak with key voices in the semantic solutions and data space, bringing together industry thought leaders, experts, and practitioners to explore the latest advancements and best practices in the implementation of data solutions and semantic layers. I am Lulit and Tesfaye, Vice President and Partner of Knowledge and Data Management at Enterprise Knowledge, your host for the Semantic Layer series on this podcast. And today I am joined by Mike Ferguson, the CEO of Intelligent Business Strategies. Mike brings over 40 years of experience in the data space, covering big data, analytics, data management, and enterprise architecture. Mike is also the conference chair and host of the Big Data London, one of the largest data conferences in Europe today. And he also teaches multiple master classes in various topics, data-related, analytics, architecture, and so forth. So Mike, welcome.
Thank you. Really good to be here, Lulit. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Absolutely. I know we've interacted a few times in the past, and I've been especially following your work for over a decade now at this point, and have had the pleasure of partnering with you on a recent engagement as well. So I am really thrilled to have this opportunity to sit down and hear from you about, your experiences, what you've been working on, especially in the eyes of someone who spent decades helping organizations and leadership navigate, shall I say, the parade of frameworks that have come and gone and the technologies that have come and gone in this space. So again, I appreciate your time. So I thought that would be a good place to kick us off, given your career and background working through transformations after transformations in the data space. I'm sure you've seen it all from mainframes to data lakes to the cloud and now AI within data. I thought it would be a good place to start with maybe you giving us a quick origin story. What first drew you into the space? What's kept you in it for all these years? And, what are you working on today?
I was a computer science graduate, so obviously naturally came out of university in that field. Very quickly started out programming and then rapidly got roped into being a database administrator and liked it a lot. And then very, very early in my career, I got the opportunity to co-found a company with a Turing Award winner who turned out to be pretty institutionally famous in data management. There's a guy called Dr. Edgar F. Codd, or Ted, as I called him. And the other guy there was a guy called Chris Date, who, if you did computer science, you probably had Introduction to Database by C.J. Date as a standard text on pretty well almost every university computer science course. So Ted and Chris were obviously ex-IBMers. They'd just come out of IBM. I got a massive stroke of luck to join them. Of course, in those days, no internet, right? And the newest kid on the block was relational database. Obviously, Ted's work caused the birth of all relational databases. It caused the birth of the SQL language, so it was hot, and we were going around the world presenting on relational databases to audiences of literally thousands, because obviously the only way to find out in those days was go to an event, right? You couldn't go on the internet because there wasn't one, right? So yeah, I had a great opportunity there. I had 4 wonderful years there, working all over the world with clients and implementing database technologies and putting together a project, whether it be for transaction processing or in those days reporting. Then I got kind of approached by a recruiter and asked if I would join a startup. And cut a long story short, I became chief architect of a startup called Teradata, which was at the end of the 1980s, so late 1989, I guess, which dragged me into Teradata HQ then, which was in Los Angeles. And so I spent the very first part of that sort of flying back and forth between UK, where I live now, and LA, but very quickly got sucked into doing more and more and more work in the US and working with a fantastically talented team of people building first massively parallel optimizer to take SQL queries and run them in parallel across multiple servers. And so that really took me into the world of analytics, as it was the first relational database aimed at the data warehousing space. It was the first parallel database. And so obviously Teradata were selling a database aimed at the analytics. It wasn't aimed at transaction processing at all. So, I spent, again, nearly 4 wonderful years, went through a few acquisitions. NCR bought Teradata in 1991. Not a lot of people maybe know that. They held on to it till 2008. So I was there through that acquisition. AT&T briefly bought NCR, which was even more complex, and then spat it out again. But that caused the move of Teradata Labs down to San Diego, where it still is today. And obviously, during that time, some of the great folks that I work with decided not to go to San Diego. They decided to go either stay in LA or go to other vendors. And so it sort of triggered the start of the massively parallel development in other vendors. And so really at the beginning of the data and analytics era. And I loved that so much, the consulting I was doing there, working with customers, helping to put together a product that was pretty groundbreaking in its day. And I loved it so much that I stayed, So I spent really since late 1989 till now, in pretty well entirely in data management and analytics. Obviously, after about 1993, I moved back to the UK and set up my own boutique industry analyst and consulting firm. Initially with a business partner who was a British guy in the US called Colin White, who's a lot older than me, and Colin retired a good 10 years ago now, I guess. But we started and stayed in the world of data and analytics, building data warehouses. I sort of ventured outside the bounds of that for a little while at the back end of the 90s, getting into enterprise portals, which took me into meeting somebody you know pretty well, which is Zach Wall. So, of course, CEO at EK. Obviously, when I was doing that, a show in the US, ended up, getting to know Zach pretty well and worked with him on a couple of occasions, long before he even set up Price Knowledge. Obviously, that helped a lot, actually, taking that detour, getting into broader areas like portals, like understanding, how to bring together collections of information. And then in addition to that, it took us into integrations with transaction processing, systems analytics, and knowledge management. So in a way, it was really enterprise architecture oriented. And so that journey did me a power of good, because it took me into a whole bunch of things which turned out to be extraordinarily valuable way down the line, sometimes a long way down the line. But then, clearly went back into data warehousing and doing a lot there. And then, sort of 2010 timeframe, 2011, we had the kind of big data explosion and Hadoop and MapReduce, and 2013 we saw Spark and a whole data science thing, lifted again the whole world of analytics and pushed it into the forefront, and of course brought in all kinds of data, including unstructured data, into the world of analytics, primarily for data science in those days. And so rode that wave, and then obviously coming out of that, back in 2016, got together with a few folks I'd known back in the 90s and put together a conference called Big Data London, which we never knew would turn out to be the largest in Europe. Back in September, we had 23,000 delegates and 17 theaters and 200 vendors and 350 speakers. So all of it stayed in the world of data and analytics. And obviously, now that we've gone into AI, it's still analytically oriented, but obviously moving into natural language has dragged in the whole unstructured world again. And for a long time, that's kind of been sitting off on left field and not really touched that much. Most of the mainstream analytical thing has been around structured data. So yeah, exciting to see that coming back in, and now people wanting to add to what they already know by starting to analyze and look at what's inside all this unstructured content.
That's a very impressive journey. I called out earlier, you've been a friend of EK. I know we've been interacting for about a decade now, and Zach. And congratulations on the conference success. I know you had a successful event end of September, so I'm looking forward to that next year. I do want to go back to the point that you called out around, where we are kind of swinging back to bringing in a broader view of data in terms of, structured, unstructured. And I think the big driver of that being the AI space that we're in right now. But what we've been kind of calling as like knowledge assets, like combined, right? Structured, unstructured, semi-structured stuff. So on that note, I'm curious to hear, you've dealt with different aspects of like not just technology, but like frameworks as a whole from a data standpoint. You talked about, relational schemas to some form of like portals and these abstractions layers. So I want to bring us to your experience with, the semantic layer, the data architectures as it relates to that. And what is your first reaction when you hear the term the semantic layer, especially today, given some of the definitions that are out there? And I'm really curious, especially if you think the industry sometimes just overcomplicates these concepts, or if you truly see transformational in terms of the semantic layer, the way we talk about it today. I want to hear your general reaction here before going into the topic.
Well, I suppose in a way, the first couple of areas got me into, if you like, my first experiences of semantic layers. I mean, I looked at the structured data world way back when BI tools emerged. If you take business objects and Cognos, for example, the very early days where they had business objects had something called a universe, and Cognos had packages, which were in a way of hiding physical data names from business users and giving them access to data in a far more business friendly way. The frustrating thing about that was every BI tool vendor had their own, and there was no industry standard. And I kept writing about why on earth can't we have an industry standard so I can do this once across all BI tools rather than have to set it up again and again. So I suppose that was the first foray. I guess the sort of second foray was really in the world of data, which kind of came around with a sort of semantic web, which has been around for a very long time now. And we saw the emergence of things like RDF and OWL and Sparkle as a language, and databases like Oracle have supported Sparkle for decades. So this isn't necessarily new technology. That's been around a long time, but I guess we ended up in a world where, let's call it, the structured data management folks were off building warehouses and moving data between transactional systems, and a lot of the semantic web background, at least in my consulting experience, was more focused on the unstructured side and web pages and documents over there. And for a long time, they kind of crossed and never met in the middle. It was kind of two different camps with a lot of similarities, but continually missing. And even though some of the larger vendors were trying to accommodate both camps, still never really saw it, come together. But I think it's really since the AI era has emerged, really actually only since generative AI has emerged, and now the agentic world, that, we have really come about trying to get context to AI agents. I mean, the whole idea of business glossaries and data governance and all of that's been around for a long, long time. And if you're, being in data governance, creating business glossaries, which historically started out as separate tools and ended up as part of a data catalog these days, and using that to understand the meaning to define common definitions for data, and then to discover physical structured data out there, mapping that to common terms would help you understand the meaning of the data. And then getting, if you like, those definitions out to so many different technologies. Data modeling needed it to stop data modelers inventing data names out of their head. Developers needed it so that we could stop developers creating APIs with data names out of their head. So there was big need for consistency across BI tools, across data modeling tools, across application development initiatives and data virtualization and many other technologies. But I think it's only really since the AI era has risen again that the term semantic layer has raised up much more than ever before. And I think it's caused confusion because, well, as well as I do, if you go out on the internet right now, there's many articles with many different definitions of what a semantic layer is. But what it's also caused is BI tools, again, coming out with a semantic layer, this time for AI agents. Similarly, we've now got knowledge graphs emerging. SAP, for example, has a knowledge graph for its dual agents. We've also gotten some more of the large application vendors moving in to acquire vendors in order to allow them to be able to do that service now, for example, acquiring data.world. And so the worlds of knowledge graphs and understanding context and understanding relevancy has kind of come about again. But what we're seeing then is knowledge graphs emerging, which weren't what BI vendors or people in the BI circles would call semantic layers on BI tools. They're looking at just common data names and definitions. Whereas over in the unstructured world, using taxonomies for a long, long time and ontologies. And I think the whole idea of an enterprise knowledge graph has risen to becoming something that I think a lot of enterprises want. And I suppose it's primarily to kind of do two things. One is to get consistency everywhere so that all AI agents, if you like, could ultimately become consistent approach to being able to understand what is relevant to the requests coming in on those AI agents. The big problem going on right now is we're in a world at the moment where everyone's now rolling out their own AI agents. And whether, everything from database vendors, Snowflake with semantic views, for example, BI vendors, as I've already mentioned, vendors like ThoughtSpot or Strategy with their semantic layers. We've got application vendors coming out with it. And I think the problem at the moment is it's very confusing. And there's lots of different semantic layers emerging within different vendors within an enterprise. And so if you're a customer and buying all of this stuff, you've got a horrible time going on right now in a sense that you're going to get all of this stuff coming in and you've got to somehow join it all up and synchronize it all and make it consistent. So I think the aspiration to build an enterprise knowledge, an ontology of your business to ultimately become I suppose you could only describe it as a digital twin of your entire business. It would be the ultimate aspiration. And then to use that metadata to feed, well, preferably to have all agents, whether they're ones that you buy out of the box or whether they're ones that you're building with what seems to be a gazillion agent builders tools emerging at the moment. It seems that all of them, need context. But I fear at the moment, even if companies start to build this, and I think they are building it, there's no question about that, we will still be left with silos of this stuff, whether they're product oriented or application oriented, so-called semantic layers. And as a result of that, we got to, there's no standard here. Well, you could argue RDF and OWL is a standard, and you could argue Sparkle is a standard, but it's not universal in the sense that it's been around a very long time, but not a lot of tools necessarily use it. I mean, there are increasing numbers of tools using it. But anyway, I think, we've even seen more standards trying to emerge. I mean, you probably saw, well, actually the night before Big Data London, Snowflake announced an open semantic interchange, declared it as a standard with a bunch of its partners to try and share this metadata between all of these technologies to get some kind of consistency. But you couldn't say that's a standard yet because it hasn't emerged. I mean, it's been announced, but not even emerged, right? So I think there's still a lot of confusion. But to me, ultimately, yes. I mean, the whole idea of an ontology and an enterprise knowledge graph would be the ideal situation. But the problem is, even if you did create that, there's no guarantee that vendor-specific software and vendor-specific AI agents are going to use it. I do think one thing is potentially exciting here, and that is MCP. Because if, for example, the metadata in a knowledge graph was accessible as a tool from an agent. In other words, the agents could use MCP services to get metadata. That would, to me, seem to be an emerging space that would make all kinds of sense. In order to be able to configure these agents to make use of those kinds of services, and obviously getting at contextual services of doing that. But I think at the moment, I think we are in danger of slipping into chaos for the next couple of years as we get into, so many different vendors peddling, if that's a terrible word to use, but selling us semantic layers, or it could be branded as something completely different. But knowledge graphs, semantic layers, I'm seeing that, and I still, because of it, I think it's going to unfortunately remain confusing. It's on people like us, I suppose, to try and understand this and figure out how to level the playing field and figure out how to get consistency and then communicate that to customers and get them on the right track. But unfortunately, we are standing on quicksand at the moment because this is changing every week.
Exactly. I mean, it's changing every minute, it feels like. I couldn't agree more. It's interesting. There are a couple of things that stand out to me from what you've shared, which is one is around really where, especially for decision makers within organizations, how challenging it is right now. And we have to empathize, especially we know, I think you and I know we've been in the space for some time now to say this is more going back to basics to a certain level, except it has, the semantic standards. Now there's more attention because of, as you called out, especially the Gen AI and then agentic AI. And what's interesting on the agentic side that I want to go back to, I really like the analogy that you give, which is this, what the ontologies and taxonomies allow you to do is build this digital twin of your business. I think that's such a great way of putting it. However, that said, I think right now the other side of this is many organizations are not even in a position to make a decision where and why and if they want agents or for what use cases. There are those that are there already. So I'm curious, I guess my question here is twofold. One is, especially empathizing with these decision makers that don't necessarily need to understand OWL or RDF or taxonomies or ontologies. What's been your experience for when it really, like, when they get it? How do you get these topics in the boardroom, the topic of standards, agnostic of products and tooling? And then the other piece is from a leadership standpoint, as you get the opportunity to talk to CIOs, CDOs, and data architects in this space. What are they actually really struggling with right now when it comes to real data challenges or understanding the meaning or realizing AI for them? What is that looking like for you?
Well, AI is already well underway in lots of companies. I mean, I think the first place I've seen it is primarily to reduce cost. I mean, it's often operational tasks that companies are trying to either accelerate with some kind of an assistant or totally automate in order to quicken the execution speed of a process and also to lower the cost of executing that process. And so ultimately, trying to allow your business operations to scale with less headcount at lower cost is really, let's say, probably the dominant use case that I saw businesses leaping on AI with. And obviously, certain places like clearly front office functions like customer service or back office functions like HR, to really make use of AI in relatively low hanging fruit areas in order to be able to, dramatically reduce costs. And obviously it's penetrated some parts of a business more than others, including IT and everything else, given that we can generate code, not just content. But I think as well, the other thing that's become clear to me in a lot of my clients is that if you survey the consumer, which is the business user effectively, then they're the ones that actually produce the value. We can build all this stuff, but it's a consumer that drives the value. And I think the thing that I've seen there coming out is that they are dying under the complexity of too many tools and want simplification as a user interface and are welcoming the idea of being able to interact and ask questions and give instructions through a natural language interface. But I think what's going on within organizations at the moment is started to run a little bit before they can walk, I mean, in the sense that, AI has taken off and has been going for a good 18 months or more in some organizations. And it's only now that some of them are getting around to looking at AI governance, for example. But in Europe, that's a big deal, especially in mainland Europe, because of the European Union AI Act is now live legislation. And so companies are liable, big and small companies, to make sure that they, have responsible AI and it's all governed. And so, but that's still an emerging space, I think. So that's probably the first place I saw AI get deployed. And I don't have a lot of surveys on this, but certainly some that I've read certainly clearly show that there's been as much success. Well, there's been a lot of failures and some successes, but nevertheless, companies seem to be getting measurable results, even if they do fail on occasion enough in order to compel them to do more.
KnowledgeCast is brought to you by Enterprise Knowledge, the world's largest dedicated knowledge management consultancy. From training to benchmarks, strategy, design, prototyping, and all the way to enterprise-level implementations, Enterprise Knowledge wants to be your services partner. Spanning the fields of knowledge management, knowledge graphs, data, learning, advanced content management, and enterprise artificial intelligence, contact us at info@enterprise-knowledge.com to discuss how we can support you.
Now, forgive me, the other part of your question was?
The other part was around when it comes to embracing AI and some of the challenges that come with it when it comes to data quality, content readiness. Where have you seen the penny drop?
Yeah, I mean, I think picking up on data quality, I mean, there's no question that AI has put the spotlight back on data governance. So I spoke a moment ago about AI governance, but it's put the spotlight back on data governance. And data governance for a lot of years, certainly I spoke at many conferences, I spoke at Enterprise Data World, for example, and DGIQ in the US for a long time, a lot of years. It was always, data governance was always just data quality. I think what's happened now is, it's much broader. It's privacy, it's access security, it's retention, it's sharing, it's usage. And I think even there, data governance has embraced AI in order to automate and speed up and be able to handle the complexities around data governance. But I do think for sure, even at board level, companies now realize that if they don't fix the governance problem, the AI isn't going to be anywhere close to as successful as they'd like. So, it's absolutely boosted. We saw that at Big Data London this year. In fact, I kind of anticipated it increased the size of the data governance theaters. It was front and center that those theaters were jammed out. And even in the data and AI strategy theater, it became pretty clear that, executives who were at the event were highlighting, data quality and data governance as a big deal. So that's put an emphasis back on data governance, and obviously things like data catalogs, which have been at the center of data governance for quite a number of years now. But the only problem there is that they've primarily only been focused on looking at structured data or semi-structured data like JSON or XML or Avro, but not unstructured. And now, only really this year, I would think that unstructured data governance has come to the fore, and now we're starting to see a whole slew of announcements just even in the last, I could even say in the last week in that space. So starting to try and bring that under a governance umbrella in order to make sure that if you're going to use data, unstructured data in the world of AI, that it too has to have governance, it has to have provenance, it has to have lineage to understand how it's been processed and prepared and made available for AI, as opposed to just letting it loose on all your unstructured data, so to speak. I mean, so I think what we're seeing now is one's put the spotlight on the other. And I would say 3 years ago, the whole world was very data management centric. Now, here we are, and so in 2022, for example, it was all data mesh, and here we are 3 years later. It's all the pendulum's way up the other end. It's all AI, right? But because of obvious things like hallucinations and whatnot, it's put a big spotlight back on on data governance, not just from data quality perspective, but also in order to make sure that you use things like data governance to identify sensitive data, which could be filtered out before you use other data to or make AI aware of enterprise data. I mean, clearly you don't want AI generating anything which reveals sensitive data, which would result in non-compliance. I really do believe that the data governance has come to the fore because of it. But data quality has been around for decades, and even there we've seen massive changes in tooling. But I think now what we have absolutely is, in fact, I just even last week I ran my AI assisted data governance class online, and I had a lot of folks on that. And certainly from what you can see now within data governance, we're now using AI in order to get it done quicker and get it done better and make sure that we do deliver, what's needed to provide solid ground for AI.
Yeah, and I think like throughout this conversation, what's really standing out to me is the pace of change, right? How fast things are changing, and sometimes how the pendulum keeps swinging back, especially coming from, traversing both data and content world. When I hear you talk about now governing unstructured content, that's, I would say, the content managers and document managers side of the world saying we know how to do that, but it's now coming to the forefront. So something that we're also seeing across the board, which is actually, it's promising, is leading to some reorganization or reorgs within organizations where they're combining these teams that typically existed in silos because the technologies lived in silos, right? The content management and Salesforce team, it was on one side, and the CRM and structured data side was on the other. But now we're seeing some of that coming together, which is promising. Coming up against time, so I want to leave you with one question and close us out. So we talked a lot about, the pace of change, especially with AI. As organizations are embracing AI, many are deploying, to your point, to production. What new leadership challenges are you seeing? And I think we talked about the change of technology and pace. So I want to expand that a little bit and say, if you could whisper one thing into a decision maker's ear or a C-level, what would be your gut check for a new data concept or a new technology to adapt or to lean into? What should not they forget from principles, like basic core foundational principles?
Keep it simple. I mean, we've got to deliver value for business. Business here, you can get sucked into all these tech, but at the same time, you've got to deliver value. We are trying to bring the world of unstructured and structured together. And I think that's becoming very relevant in a lot of organizations. One thing I do see is a really big issue for a lot of organizations, and that's organization. How do you organize this? You mentioned structured and those teams coming together now. I see it's even bigger than that because we're trying to democratize this. We've failed miserably in the past doing that. I mean, we had centralized with IT doing everything. That just got outpaced by business demand. We ran up the other end in 2013 with self-service data prep and basically handed out all the users, let the users go buy their own tools and say, here you are, here's all the connectors, you figure it out, right? And that failed miserably because we got the Wild West. And now I think what I'm seeing is companies trying to get a federated operating model going, where there is some kind of program office in order to kind of, put in place common infrastructure, but also to coordinate the development of all this stuff going on around the enterprise and keep it firmly focused on outcomes so that people aren't just building agents for the hell of it or building data products or building models. Let's say we're trying to reduce fraud by 10% by the middle of next year. So what data products, what AI agents, what machine learning models, what BI are you doing, and how are we getting context to all of that in order to deliver on that outcome? And so it's coordinating a lot of different teams around the enterprise producing in order to be able to get stuff in place to empower the consumers to drive that value. So I think organization is a big thing. I think the second thing I would say is we are beginning to start to see universal platforms because lack of standards have frustrated companies for so long. And the reason there's a lack of standards, in my opinion, is purely because vendors don't see it as a benefit to them. So most vendors are refusing to adopt standards for business reasons. There has not been a widely adopted industry standard to exchange metadata between any tools for decades. I've certainly seen 4 attempts in my lifetime all fail. But at the end of the day, there's no technical reason why not. It's purely because it's not in a vendor's business interest to give away their metadata. So because there's a lack of standard adoption, even you could argue that there are so-called standards out there, and there's plenty of them. But because there's lack of adoption, I'm seeing companies now moving towards single platforms of pre-integrated tooling because they're fed up of trying to stitch together tools that they just can't work, and it's just taking too long, it's too slow, it's too expensive to do all of that. And so you're naturally seeing, especially I would say data fabric vendors really beginning to take hold and get significant market share. So we saw small vendors some years ago talking about modern data stack, and that's just been pushed aside by data fabric now. But I do think there's a new layer in the stack. And I guess the one thing I'm saying this year that I didn't say last year to all my clients is the new layer in the stack is the enterprise ontology. It has to come in between everything that's wanting to use that data and sort of sit between all of those tools and agents and all that data, structured or unstructured, and be able to provide the context that everybody needs to give you the consistency. So I see that as a new layer in the stack this year. And so I have been recommending to my clients to put this in place. The problem is the structured vendors who've been in data management and the governance vendors, data catalog vendors more specifically, are now all starting to scan unstructured content and all adding it to almost all of the main data catalog vendors out there are already storing their metadata in a graph. In some cases, it's an RDF graph. In some cases, it's property graph. But as those vendors now start to scan unstructured content, I've seen several announcements in the last couple of weeks, one just a few days ago. So as we see that, then on the one side, you've got let's go and build all of this ourselves. And at the same time, there's the growing capturing of metadata about unstructured content. And by the way, this is where taxonomies really matter because catalogs need to get a taxonomy in order to be able to understand what the tags should be, in order to be able to then know what the values of those tags should be in order to tag content in order to add to its own catalog. So these worlds have to come together. And so I suppose at the moment we've got companies trying to build their own knowledge graph, and at the same time, catalog vendors are on a journey that could at some point get them to a point where they say, well, we can hold the knowledge graph. I kind of see these worlds colliding a little bit, but it's not done by any stretch. We are still very, very new into that space, but I genuinely think for the AI era, we need an enterprise ontology to deliver everything that's needed. Otherwise there's a big hole in the stack. But I do think we're going to go, unfortunately, through a classic cycle that we've seen in technology for years, which is, where we have a number of disparate technologies which will ultimately consolidate. And unfortunately, because this is such a new space, and every vendor's coming out with their own semantic layer capabilities, we are forced to have to go through the pain of trying to get it all together. But that's why I like the whole enterprise ontology thing. That if we build that and we get consistency there, then at the very least you can disseminate it, level the playing field. I think over the next couple of years, unfortunately, we're going to have to live with silos of this stuff at the same time. So that it's putting customers and you could argue, well, why can't we all have a standard? Well, I could have said, well, why not use Sparkle and RDF&L? That's been around for years. But then in which case you could equally go to Snowflake and say, well, why did you announce open semantic interchange when we could get everybody to use that, right? So unfortunately, we got a lot of stuff emerging. It's not consistent. And I don't yet see a dominant standard. And unless we do, we're going to live with these inconsistencies for a while, and therefore customers are going to be forced to drive consistency across all of the technologies they're using. And I suppose that means getting on to, building their own enterprise ontology is a very good way of putting them in a position to be able to do that.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. I would say our team of ontologists are very excited. We're all excited to be cool kids again at this point. But two things that I want to emphasize from what you've shared is around, the universal standards that we're all striving for. I would say the technology probably was not there 10 years ago or so when it comes to combining these forces. Now we have a different problem. We have many tooling and technology. Technology is not the problem. It is how do we standardize agnostic of technology, what to adapt, and then the supporting organizational operating model. I think something that you were alluding to as to like the key takeaway, look at how you structure around these pieces and beyond the artificial or traditional silos. I really appreciate these takeaways, Mike. Thank you again for being here. This has been such a refreshing conversation, bridging different eras together and the foundational principles with, the cutting edge that we're seeing right now. And for anyone who's listening, who's curious about your work and wants to follow your journey, we'll provide your contact information and any resources you would like to share in the show notes of this series. And to our listeners, thanks again for joining us for this episode of the Semantic Layer series on KnowledgeCast. To learn more, visit our website at enterprise-knowledge.com. Until next time, thanks all.